So again, we're looking at John 19, the first 11 verses this morning. I look forward to seeing what the Lord has for us today. Now, if you think about our lives here in America, you think about American culture, but also other cultures of the world, we don't like to suffer. In fact, we do everything that we can to get away from suffering. But there is an exception to this. There is an exception where we actually are fine with suffering. There may be more than this, but I'll just focus on this one. Most people are willing to suffer some if it's part of doing something that they love. Think of sports, for example. Think of football. Football is probably the top American sport that's uniquely American. Think of boxing. How about mixed martial arts? How about basketball? Think of so many of these sports, and they all involve suffering. They just about all involve injuries. They involve pain. And so anyone who plays these sports is going to suffer. Even just practicing for these sports involves suffering. It means pushing yourself as hard as you can to win, even though your whole body is screaming at you in pain that you need a rest. These sports always involve physical injuries, right? Basketball might be the safest of the ones that I mentioned, but you still have people who breaking limbs and spraining ankles and need to recover from that. People get hurt all the time in these sports, but you would think, you think through all the injuries, you think of all the concussions in football, you think, oh, these sports are going to lose in popularity. But no, these sports are as popular as ever, even though there is so much pain and suffering involved in these sports. Why is that? Why is it that this pain and suffering is so popular? People willingly devote hours and hours of their day, days of their month, months of their year to play these sports, even though it means so much pain and agony and even disappointment, and it's just very difficult. Why is that? It's because people love them. People love these sports. And since they love playing them, suffering's fine. We can handle the suffering. We're okay with the suffering because I love playing the sport. The enjoyment of playing the sport is so much greater than the suffering that's associated with that. People are willing to suffer for something that they love. In fact, they're happy to. Say, bring it on. I don't care. Let's get the basketball and get down there. Who cares if I break a leg? It's going to be fun doing it, right? When we look at this passage today, we see something similar. We see that suffering can never compare to the suffering. In this passage, we will see suffering that can never compare to the suffering that athletes face. In fact, part of me wants to call this infinite suffering, what Christ faced. And I think it is infinite in certain ways, but it is suffering that has never been faced by anyone else who has ever lived. Not only was this pain intense, but the person going through the suffering was eternal. And the reason for the suffering was the whole universe and all the people in it. You and I are part of this suffering that Jesus faced. We are an important, intricate part of it. And just like the average athlete doesn't just play sports because they love the pain, you might have a few, what do you call them, masochists out there that embrace the pain and so forth, but that's normally not what happens. Jesus was the same way. He didn't want to go through all that pain, but he went through the pain not because he loved the pain, but because he loved, as John 3:16 says, the world. As we look at this passage today, we'll see some of the intense suffering that Jesus went through for us. Again, this is not even before he got to the cross, and this suffering was so intense. This suffering alone would have killed people. And this suffering that we'll see here must shake us from our apathy about the gospel. We so often just go through our day, gospel, might not even register a blip on our mental radar, right? But as we've said many times here at Hope Baptist Church, we should be preaching the gospel to ourselves every day. So this suffering should shake us from not really caring about the gospel, and it must inspire us to more faithful worship of Jesus. When you see what Christ went through for us, we should not be able to help but worship him even more intensely and from the heart. So the first thing we'll see here today from verses 1 through 3 is that we must worship Jesus because though innocent, he suffered intense physical abuse for us. We must worship Jesus because even though he was innocent, he suffered intense physical abuse for us. Now look with me, if you would, at John 19, verses 1 through 3. Again, it says, "Then Pilate, the Roman governor, took Jesus and flogged him." That means whipped him very severely. "And the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head and arrayed him in a purple robe. They came up to him saying, 'Hail, King of the Jews,' and struck him with their hands." Now, even though Pilate, he knew that Jesus was innocent, he could not find anything wrong with Jesus. But he flogged him anyway. There's some disagreement among those who study the Bible a lot for a living and write books about the Bible about how many times Jesus was flogged or whipped in this short period of time before his crucifixion. Some say he was whipped twice, once before he was sentenced to be crucified and once after he was sentenced to be crucified. The one before, the whipping before, it was more like a spanking, right? It wouldn't have been horrible, but it definitely would have hurt. And then the one after him being sentenced to crucifixion would have been the horrible one with the cat of nine tails, nine strands of leather with pieces of bone and rock tied within those strands. So when Jesus was whipped, it wasn't just designed to whip the person and bounce right back off. It was designed to whip him, to latch onto his skin, to latch onto the muscles underneath his skin, and then when they pulled that whip away, it would rip shreds of skin and muscle away with it. Over and over and over again. So as I said, scholars disagree about how many times Jesus was whipped, because it's not entirely clear as you read all four Gospels. Some say twice, some say once. And I personally, just reading briefly the evidence, I'm going to go with once. I'm going to say this flogging here that Pilate talks about was the horrible flogging. It was a type of flogging that would have killed people. Just that alone. So, just imagine that. Imagine the bloody torso of Jesus. You could see bone, you could see internal organs probably as well. And that's just one part of what Jesus suffered for us. Now, Jesus was innocent. Pilate knew Jesus was innocent, yet he said, flog him anyway. And so this would have been the most painful, even one lash of that whip, but over and over and over again. Just think of the pain of that. But that's not all that happened. Here we see that the soldiers mocked him as well, and they mocked him in a very painful way. As it says in verse 2, the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns. So they would have had to go outside, probably, and they were probably thinking, how can we, make fun of this king of the Jews? How can we do that? Oh, I know. Well, let's make him a crown. What do we make the crown of? Well, let's make a painful crown out of these thorns that grew off of this tree that were probably around this long. Anywhere from a few inches to even 12 inches long, these thorns could grow. And so they take them and they weave them together, and they, I'm sure they don't just gently drop it on his head. I'm sure they place it firmly on his head. Now think of that. We've all been pricked with a pin before, right? Yeah. And you think of that, just pricking your finger, just one little prick, how that stings, how that hurts. Well, I would say our scalps are even more sensitive than that. So imagine pricking your scalp with that pin. Not super crazy, but just, you would definitely feel it. That would be definitely uncomfortable. But imagine not just that, but you actually jam it in so it hits your skull. Now imagine that happening maybe 10 times all over your head. and then it being moved around, and the blood starts to flow. It was what Jesus went through for us. This was so painful, this was so horrible, yet it was also designed to make fun of him. Because they all said, oh, King of the Jews, he's no king. How could any king suffer like this? We'll make an example of him. So they made fun of him while they did this. And then they also arrayed him, it says, in a purple robe. Said, well, let's make sure we make the outfit complete, right? Let's give him this purple robe that we have so that we can fully make fun of him. But they didn't stop there either. Again, these are Pilate's soldiers. They came up to him in verse 3 saying, "Hail, King of the Jews." So they didn't just like put him in a corner somewhere. They pretended to worship him. They mocked him in that way. Now, maybe we as adults, we don't do that as much. Maybe we do, but usually children we'd see more of that. But anyway, they seem to enjoy this, making fun of the King of the universe. Hail, King of the Jews. And then it says they struck him with their hands. This probably would have been slaps. It probably would have been full-on punches to the face. And just think, bloodied from the head down, bloodied from the torso down, swollen. And we know Jesus suffered in more ways as well, the beard ripped out, although John doesn't mention that here. Just think of the pain that Jesus was going through. I mean, just what he went through there would, again, be enough to kill people. Certainly enough to cause people to faint from how extreme that pain was. But yet Jesus endured it. He went through with it. He survived that part of the crucifixion. He went through it because he loved us. So we see here that we must worship Jesus because though innocent, he suffered intense physical abuse for us. They just kept layering the pain over and over. They said, all right, that's not enough pain. Let's put some more on there. That's not enough. Let's put some more on there. And the pain and the shame just kept increasing and increasing and increasing. And Jesus did all that. He went through all that for us. He wants our heart. He did that so that we could have salvation from sin, so we could be his children, we could be his friends. We must worship Jesus because though innocent, he suffered intense physical abuse for us. Now, as we look at these verses that describe Jesus' suffering, and we can look at all the verses in the Bible that describe Jesus' suffering, I believe there are several ways that this should affect us. I think right now we're affected, right? We're stunned. We just stop and, we think, we've heard this as a Bible story, right? Jesus died for our sins. And it can just easily become, something that we don't think about. We hear it, but we don't think about what it actually means. It's stunning when you actually stop and think about what this meant. And you think, how would you feel? How would you survive if you went through the suffering that Jesus went through? Would you be able to stand? Would you be dead by this time at the stage of suffering that Jesus faced? Some of us might be, because of how brutal this was. But yet Jesus kept with it. He did not turn back. He did not give up. He did not faint. He did not run away. He did not call down a legion of angels to rescue him. He stayed the course. So we should be completely stunned at the level of abuse and mockery. This is the infinite, eternal Son of God that went through this. And for those of us who have been believers and have read or heard this story over and over again, we can easily lose sight of how brutal and how objectionable, how R-rated Jesus' suffering was. It should move us every time we read and think about it. Just like when you see something so stunning, you can't get your mind off of it. And we know what that's like. We've seen things throughout our lives that once we see it, we can't unsee it. It should be the same for this. But I would say also we should be overwhelmed with the fact that Jesus did this for us. We move from the shock and awe of it to, this was for me. We should be overwhelmed with that. And then we should be moved with deep love. We realize this was for me. Man, how I love Jesus. how I love Jesus for all that he did for me. And then, fourth, to life change, to confession, to surrender. This love should move us to sacrifice for him. According to our memory verse, sacrifice from the heart for him, and to follow him no matter where he leads. So when we preach this gospel to ourselves every day, and there are many ways you can preach it, there are many parts of the gospel you can meditate on. You don't just have to meditate on this part when you preach the gospel to yourself every day. But whenever we preach the gospel to ourselves every day, these are ways that God calls us to respond. It's not enough to think about it and then move on to the next thing. God always wants a response. This whole Bible here was given, inspired by God, for reproof, for correction, for instruction in righteousness, and also teaching at the beginning there. This Bible is intended to cause you and to cause me to respond. How are you responding? Because I guarantee you, you will respond one way or another. You will either respond by outright rejection, no, it's not for me, or hatred. You will respond by, maybe I'll think about it. You'll respond, I don't think I care about that. Or, of course, you'll respond in obedience and love. God calls us to respond. How will you respond? Even if you're a believer here today, how will you respond today to this powerful gospel message of the suffering of Jesus Christ? So we must worship Jesus because though innocent, he suffered intense physical abuse for us. Next thing I believe we see here in this passage is that we must worship Jesus because though innocent, he suffered intense hatred for us. Intense hatred for us. Look with me at verses 4 through 7 if you have a Bible. The story continues. Pilate went out again and said to them, "See, I'm bringing him out to you that you may know that I find no guilt in him." So Jesus came out, wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to them, "Behold the man." When the chief priests and the officers saw him, they cried out, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him." The Jews answered him, "We have a law, and according to that law he ought to die because he's made himself the Son of God."
Yeah, because God is the Son.
Now, as we look at this passage here today, we're going to see the intense hatred that Jesus faced for us. So, think back, think of all the pain that Jesus went through. Think of all the pain that Pilate allowed his soldiers to do to Jesus. Again, these weren't the Jews who hated him. These were Romans who didn't really care about him. But yet they hurt him so much. And this was all on Pilate. And now think with me, for those of you that were here several weeks ago, and even before that, when we've been walking through the earlier part of this passage, what did Pilate care about? The only thing he cared about was himself. And part of caring about himself was he did not want to break Roman law, which he would have broken Roman law if he would sentenced an innocent man to death. That would have broken Roman law. But he also wanted to stay in power. And to stay in power, he couldn't have the Jews getting all upset at him and causing problems. So Pilate here is thinking, how do I balance these two things? How do I keep the Jews happy? How do I not break the law and make the Romans unhappy with me? How do I do it? So he is stuck between these two rocks and hard places, you could say, and he's trying to find a way through so he can preserve his own comfort and lifestyle. He doesn't care about Jesus. He doesn't care about the truth, as we saw in the previous chapter. He just cares about keeping things okay for himself. And so, why would he have ever had Jesus beaten and abused and the crown jammed on his head and mocked? Why would he have ever allowed that if he knew Jesus was innocent? Because he's trying to balance those two pressures. He's thinking, all right, I can't kill an innocent man. I can't kill an innocent man. I can't kill an innocent man. But I can maybe hurt him enough so that the Jews back off and don't demand that he be killed. I think that's what was going on here, where he thought, if I make Jesus look bad enough, if I make him look unrecognizable even, then the Jews will say, all right, let him go. I guess he's suffered enough. This isn't written in the Bible, but just reading between the lines and judging the whole scenario, I think this is what's going on in Pilate's mind. So, now that you are thinking that direction, think of what happens now in verse 4. So, verse 4, Pilate went out again and said to them, "See, I'm bringing him out to you that you may know I find no guilt in him." Now think of the irony of that. Think of the injustice in that. Hey, here he comes. Just so you know, there's nothing. I find no guilt in him. Jesus walks out, and you look at Jesus, a bloody pulp, and you're like, well, if he's not guilty, why did you hurt him like that? But this is Pilate saying, wink, wink, he's not guilty. Here he is. You're okay with where things are now, right? That's what Pilate, I think, is asking, sort of with how he's bringing Jesus out and presenting him, representing him to the Jews. And I think, again, he was hoping that all the blood, the crown of thorns, the complete disfigurement, the mocking, the purple robe, that they would all just be horrified and say, oh, wow. I think we need to back off, guys. I think we've gone too far with Jesus. I think he's learned his lesson. Maybe we should just let him live and not demand his death. But at this moment, Jesus came out. Again, he was wearing the purple robe, the crown of thorns, showing his humiliation, completely disfigured, looked completely opposite to how an innocent man should look under the circumstances. And Pilate says, look, here is the man. Here is the man that you wanted to crucify a little bit earlier. Don't you think he's good now? But immediately, if you look with me at your Bibles, look with me at verse 6. When the chief priests and the officers saw him, they cried out, it's all good. No, that's not. They hated Jesus so much. Seeing him so disfigured before them, seeing him so shamed before them, that did not in one bit make them feel sorry for Jesus. They kept on with such intense hatred, and they cried out, crucify him, crucify him. They were not going to be satisfied until Jesus was dead. So their hatred came out so clearly, and as I mentioned a few Sundays ago, it was likely just the chief priests and their immediate followers who were calling for Jesus' crucifixion. The crowd, probably, if the religious leaders weren't there, the crowd would have been like, oh, no, it's good, leave him alone. But it was the religious leaders that hated Jesus so much. And we know that they stirred up the crowd. Pilate thought, hey, if I make him look bad enough and so forth, then, if I release Barabbas, they'll choose Barabbas, because the crowd might not, they'll release Jesus instead of Barabbas because of who the crowd would have liked more. But Pilate did not play this well. He did not realize how huge the hatred for Jesus actually was among the religious leaders. So, once the religious leaders were able to then influence the crowd, Pilate knew there wasn't much he could do. So he's still trying to find his way, trying to weasel his way out of this. And so if you look with me at verse 6, I think what we see here is Pilate thought they might be bluffing. Maybe they're bluffing. I'm going to call their bluff. So what does Pilate say in verse 6? After they say crucify him, Pilate said to them, take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no guilt in this man. Now, what's Pilate doing? Pilate knew that they weren't going to go crucify Jesus themselves because they would have been committing an offense against Roman law, and they could not do that. So Pilate is just trying to make it difficult for the Jews. He's trying to make it so difficult that they give up. And I think that's what's going on by what he said here. But the Jews wouldn't fall for it. If you look with me at verse 7, the Jews answered him, we have a law. Pilate, you have a law. But we have a law too, Pilate. We have a law, and according to that law, he ought to die because he has made himself the Son of God. In other words, he has committed blasphemy, and the punishment for blasphemy is death. There is what they're saying. And so they were willing to just keep butting heads with Pilate until they got what they want. So the Jews, again, they had no military power. They believed they had enough leverage with Pilate. I think they knew that if they pushed hard enough, they would get it, because Pilate's situation wasn't all that great. And they knew that they could easily get Pilate in trouble if they tried hard enough. And so they knew they could keep pushing to get what they wanted. And so what we see here again is Christ suffered hatred for us, so much hatred, such intense hatred for us, so that we can put to death our hatred for others. It's easy to hate people, isn't it? But Jesus suffered so much hatred so that we could confess and forsake that hatred. We must worship Jesus because, though innocent, he suffered intense hatred for us. Now, as I said, we all probably know the feeling of intense hatred towards someone or something. Let's say, for example, you hate having a mouse in your house. You find out, oh, we got a mouse, and it's like, you're thinking, middle of the night, where is that mouse? Is it crawling all over our kitchen countertops? Is it crawling all over our couch and chairs and getting in our food? And what is this mouse doing? When you start thinking about it, you're like, we got to get rid of this mouse. Because you hate having a mouse. It might not be it might be something else. Cockroaches are pretty hated too, right? And so you start going through a plan. You start scheming. You think, how can I get rid of this mouse? And you start to strategize. And you take as long as you need to figure out how to get rid of that pest. You might not even take a day off. You're like, I'm not going to be able to rest until I get rid of this thing that I hate so much. So we may know what it's like to have intense hatred toward a thing, but also towards a person. Everyone in this room has been hurt by someone else before. We've all been hurt. We've been hurt physically, we've been hurt emotionally, perhaps other ways as well. And the temptation is to react in intense hatred, bitterness and hatred. There may be someone that's coming to your mind right now that you hate because of what they did to you, or what you perceive that they did to you at least, or maybe what they were part of, something that happened to you, and you hate them. You'd be happy if they were dead. Not that you would go out and kill them, but you would probably be happy if they died. Again, maybe they've caused you great pain or hurt. Maybe they've hurt someone you love. Maybe you hate that they keep doing bad things and keep getting away with it. And there's some justice to that, right? But Jesus willingly took that kind of hatred on himself so that those who hated him could have the opportunity to be saved. We must worship Christ for all the intense hatred that he suffered for us, that he suffered for you and for me. And we must examine our own lives and hearts to see if we have hatred, to see if we have bitterness towards others. Christ suffered hatred for us so that we can put to death our hatred for others, and so, as we see here, so that we could actually be saved and rescued and have eternal life. We must worship Jesus because, though innocent, he suffered intense hatred for us. And then lastly, here in this passage, we see here what I would call the final point of our message, and that is we must worship Jesus because, though innocent, he submitted. He submitted to intense suffering. Verses 8 through 11, if you look at those with me. When Pilate heard this statement, he was even more afraid. He entered his headquarters again and said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave him no answer. So Pilate said to him, "You won't speak to me? Do you not know that I have authority to release you and authority to crucify you?" Jesus answered him, "You would have no authority over me at all, unless it had been given to you from above. Therefore, he who delivered me over to you has the greater sin." We must worship Jesus because, though innocent, He submitted to intense suffering for us. So at this point in the story, Pilate is severely rattled. Again, he is trying this. He is trying that. When that fails, he tries something else. When that fails, he tries something else. He's trying to maintain his position. He's trying not to break the law. He's trying to maintain comfort, but he doesn't care anything about Jesus. But at this point, he's severely rattled. He sees how intense and intent the Jews are to have Jesus crucified. And when he hears about their law, he thinks, oh boy, now I've got a Jewish law that I've got to deal with. What am I getting into now? I got to go talk to Jesus again. So at this point, he doesn't want to cause problems in Judea by pushing against the law of the Jews. Yet, he has his own laws again that he has to abide by. He has to obey his own laws too, or else Rome comes after him. He has already been afraid of this situation. Pilate's already been afraid, but now, as it says here in verse 8, he was even more afraid. We know that Pilate's wife had had a dream. She was afraid. They're struggling here. But again, they don't care about the truth. They just care about what they can see in their own idea of comfort and lifestyle, like most people in the world today. So he's very rattled. He doesn't want to cause problems. He's very afraid. He went back into his headquarters, we see. He had Jesus brought back in, and he questioned him some more. Now, why would he have needed to question Jesus more? Well, because he doesn't know what to do. So he asks him this question. Where are you from? You know, maybe there's some rhyme or reason to that, but Pilate's just trying to figure out, where do I go with this, I think. You know, he's claiming to be the Son of God. Let me see if I can work my way through this to figure out some hole in his argument or something maybe. Where are you from? But see, at this point, Jesus had already attempted to evangelize Pilate. He had already confronted Pilate with the truth. And what did Pilate say? What is truth? But he didn't stick around for an answer. And he just went out and he wanted, you know, just to get rid of you know, have Jesus and the whole situation just disappear from him. He didn't care. And Jesus knew that. And so at this point, as it says, Jesus gave him no answer. Why? Because no answer would be beneficial. But now Pilate's stressed again, and he says in verse 10, "You won't speak to me? Do you not know that I am the only thing standing between them and the cross?" And at that point, Jesus answers. Jesus answers, and he says, "Pilate, any authority that you have is given, as it says here, is given to you from above." All right, so you're a very, 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 very small piece of the puzzle here, Pilate, and you need to recognize that. You're not as influential and as big and as powerful as you say you are. And I think Pilate knew that. He knew he was in a very difficult situation, and he knew that he would do whatever he had to do to try to keep things calm. So yes, he had no authority. He wasn't willing to make the sacrifice of standing up to the injustice because it might mean a revolt on his hands. He wasn't willing to do that. And Jesus then finishes his little quote there, speech to Pilate. He says, "Therefore he who delivered me over to you has the greater sin." He's saying, Pilate, what you're doing here is sin. You are breaking a law, Pilate, but you're not the main lawbreaker here. And when we think of who delivered him over, I think who Jesus was probably referring to was the high priest, Caiaphas, if you have to point to one person. Caiaphas, the religious leader of the nation, was the most corrupt, the most hateful of Jesus, the most hateful of God of all the people in the land. Again, imagine the irony. The spiritual leader is the least spiritual person in the whole land. He was the one that delivered Jesus over to Pilate to try to get the death sentence so they could get rid of Jesus. So, we must worship Jesus because though innocent, he submitted to intense suffering for us. Now, even though Jesus had all the power to escape from his suffering, right? We know that Jesus, being the Son of God, could have called down a legion of angels and delivered him, and he could have just snapped his fingers, and everyone would have been dead, right? He had that power. He could have done that. He's the Son of God, but he went through the humiliation instead. He willingly submitted to the humiliation and the suffering. And when he could have argued his innocence and tried to escape, he remained silent. This was an opportunity for him to start, well, Pilate, let me tell you again why I'm innocent. Jesus was willing to go to the cross for us. He had made up his mind. He wasn't going to turn his back on his Father. Think for a minute how hard it is to remain silent when you and I are suffering injustice, when we're suffering pain, when we're suffering shame and abuse. That's completely unnatural to us. We, as a reflex, will at least say something. We might shout out. We might physically react to when we face those things because that's how we're wired. And part of that's a survival mechanism, right? Part of it is that all we care about is ourselves. The flesh within us is so strong. So it's completely unnatural for us to just quietly, patiently, silently suffer. But that's what Jesus did. Jesus did not react. He did not fight back. He did not complain. He didn't yell or scream or punch back. He was overcome with love for his Father. He was overcome with obedience to his Father. He willingly laid down his life for us. Since Jesus submitted quietly to his Father's will for him, what does that mean for us? We know that God's will often means suffering. We know that God's will often means making hard decisions that will make our lives more difficult. And we naturally want to complain. We naturally want to push back. We don't want to suffer quietly. We don't want to be submissive. What does that mean for us? How should we react? Think of your own situations right now. How is God calling you to embrace his will, even though it might mean suffering? To embrace it willingly. There will be times when it will be the Father's will for us to suffer quietly and to keep trusting him. I'm not saying that's always the case. There are times when we're suffering and there are God-given ways for us to react to or respond to our suffering. But at times, and God makes this clear, I think, there are times we know there's not much we can do. And when those times happen, rather than lash out in anger, lash out in frustration, we should follow Jesus' example. We must worship Jesus because, though innocent, he submitted to intense suffering for us. And this brings us to what I would call the main idea, the main takeaway of the passage. If you had to say, what did we learn today? What is this passage about today? And you can just come away with one thing. I would say come away with this. We must worship Jesus because, though innocent, he suffered for us. We must worship Jesus because, though innocent, he suffered for us. As human beings, we think about what we love, right? We do what we love. We fight for what we love. Through his unjust suffering, Jesus showed how much he loved us. Just like the athlete, just like the MMA fighter who's willing to have black eye after black eye, broken rib after broken rib, he gets back out there. He gets back out there the next, or she gets back out there the next opportunity. Even though it's so painful, they love the sport. If we love Jesus, if we love others, maybe we should see a comparison here, right? We do what we will go through suffering if it means doing what we love, if it means loving the one that we genuinely love. God has called us to love, and he's called us to live out that love through embracing suffering, through submitting to suffering. Christ fought against the temptation to respond in self-interest and in self-centeredness. He fought against that anxiety. I'm sure he was very angry. Christ was going to be separated from the one he loved the most, his Father. The eternal Son of God was going to be separated from the eternal Father and from the eternal Spirit as well. Something that had never happened before. In all of eternity, Christ was going to do that to provide salvation for us. I think he was a little concerned about that, right? But he pushed back, just like he faithfully survived the 3 temptations in the wilderness, so Christ continued to fight back against the temptation to respond in an ungodly way. So people, members, attendees of Hope Baptist Church today, he loved us so much. The unworthy creatures that we are, that he fought for us. He died for us. How should we respond to him? We must worship Jesus because, though innocent, he suffered for us.